Okay, so I've done this one long, I've done this one short. I've done this one in all sorts of different ways, and I haven't always liked it. So I'm giving it a go, and I'm hoping this version is going to work. I'm hoping it is. But this is the Long Patrol for what happens if, well, if helicopters come about a lot earlier. If they really do come about a lot earlier. And that's an interesting one. Why is it so interesting? Because when you look at the actual technology required to make helicopters work, the actual technology used, especially by the 1950s, early 60s designs, it's infuriatingly not that much more than 1930s, early 40s tech. In fact, pretty much the big thing in it, the really big thing, is the rotor blades. And that's something which sort of comes about slowly because no one's really funding the development of helicopters until you get to roughly World War II. So if anyone had been funding them earlier, considering the presses required to manipulate aluminium and design and make those kinds of blades which were used on earlier helicopters, is all available at the time. It's just actually doing it. It's more a development of technique rather than equipment. Okay, that is something you have to really talk about when you talk about technology, because sometimes with technological developments you have all the ingredients there to make something, but it's until someone's really working on it and really applying it, they don't think, well, hang on, if we just do that with that with that and then do that, that'll work. This is what I mean by when I discuss technology. Sometimes it's a great leap, and sometimes it's a process of trial and elimination and a load of testing. And really, once you've got round the idea of helicopters actually being viable, it's viable to make something be able to work with a rotary or fling wing scenario. Once you've worked out that is an option, improving upon that is far more, especially up until we get to really the late 1960s, improving on that is far more of a evolutionary development by trial and error than it is a great, whee, jump forward, we've made it. Now, yes, there are some things which are interesting, and I always have a feeling when I get into this, there's going to be far more people talking about sonar and dipping sonar especially, and its viability of being created earlier on. The thing is, again, it's one of those things where there is forms of dipping sonar around in this period. It's just they're used from boats, and they well, boats and ships, and they're used as part of the oceanographic study, and they're all scientific experimental stuff. But the thing is, if you already have the concept, you already have an experimental test. When they're eventually developing the dipping sonar and actually developing it into what we call dipping sonar for helicopters, they're referencing some of these tests and these elements back in the 20s, back in the 30s. And again, when you look at the stuff, if you want to have a system which is going to analyze data, i.e. a very complicated advanced system like we used to say, no, you cannot replicate that in the 1940s. You cannot. The wonderful Merlin, the various other helicopters you have around today, you cannot go back to the 1940s and go, we can create that level of tech then. No, there's a whole load of tech you can't do. But there are things you can do. There are things you can do, and when you realize that you're still going to be dealing with submarines, because the real development in submarines, the Type 21X and those sort of vessels, and of the Germans, there's a reason they come together in the period of war they do. There's a lot of development going on which comes in. And by the way, the Germans basically nick a whole load of technology and development off the Dutch. I mean, the Germans were going down quite a few wrong alleyways in their development until they took over the Netherlands and went, Oh, frigate, they're doing really well. And I know there's often the thing of, well, you know, they had teams moved into the Netherlands doing development. Yes, they did have some teams, but those teams weren't necessarily working on the right stuff. When you look at what actually goes into the fast submarines they develop, yeah, that's purely down to the Dutch. And even that development is dependent upon a lot of war effort and a lot of war experience, which could well have been altered by this. So one of the things I will start off with is I'm not going to go much into World War II. I'm not going to talk about World War II and the events in World War II, because if helicopters are viable in the 1930s, A, all sides will probably have them, but B, it's going to change so much. It's going to change your design of ships. It's going to change what you need for an escort carrier. Because let's be honest, the Condor is not much of a threat. Okay? Occasionally they turn up. But they're not really a big threat. The reason they're being attacked is because they're being used to find the convoys. So they're worthwhile taking out. Which is why you start having escort carriers with fighters to take out the Condors. In there are bays, the Bay of Biscay and things like that. Yes, you want a fighter carrier. But if we think about it, for the most Atlantic crossing, being able to take 16 or so helicopters on a merchant ship, and all the conversion you have to do is stick in a hangar structure, some space for the personnel, and a large lump of steel which can take the weight of landing and taking off. You don't have to put in catapults. You don't have to think about going into or out of the wind. You don't have to have a full-length flight deck, so you're not converting a whole ship and changing on. You are converting maybe the front of a ship or the back of the ship. Suddenly, it's a far quicker, far easier process to adapt, and you can far more quickly have those systems there. And again, it's the range of the helicopters. People can go, well, the earlier helicopters won't have a long range. They probably won't. But do they need a long range? What are we asking for them? And again, this is a World War scenario, so it's not like today where we need a lot of range and speed and capabilities because you literally will have one or two helicopters there because because no one invests in the real depth in defense anymore. That's all, after all, they went through the whole of the post-Cold War. Wars are now going to be wars of choice. We're never going to go in a war unless we choose to be in the war. No one else has a vote other than the West because we are so advanced, so technology, because we won the Cold War. Don't get me started on that. I've done whole other videos on that subject, and yeah, Cold War wasn't something you won or lost. It's something you survived or you didn't, and that's very different connotations from a win or a loss. But there are videos which explain it on this channel. The reality is, in World War II, the mass would not have been the problem. You know, fine. That's why I'm saying 16 helicopters. And again, you probably have sloops and things. And we'll get into all this, but the thing is, it changes greatly once you have a helicopter. And the big thing it changes is the entire approach of both the Americans and the British to aviation from their regular ships. Because the big problem with seaplanes is you have to stop to retrieve them. Yes, you can theoretically do it at a run if you're very precise, very lucky, but it's not going fast for a warship and it's going in a straight line. And if you're the Royal Navy, you zigzag. You zigzag even in your sleep. You don't like doing in a straight line. You don't like being predictable about where you're going to end up, because that makes it easier for a submarine to try and sink you. And as I said before, the Royal Navy has nightmares of Abercrombie, Cressy and Hogue. It's one of those things. But it also affects the US Navy as well. At certain points, they start getting very, very anti the idea of pausing to recover seaplanes. And helicopters, you don't have to. Now, it is going to change the design of pretty much everything. Think about ships. Think about the way they're designed. Think about how you operate helicopters. There is a reason why modern warships all look pretty much the same these days. I do laugh when some people, commentators, say on various television programs, oh, warships don't look like proper warships anymore. They do. It's just, in a nice way, the realities of a warship today means it's dominated by, honestly, by systems which it offloads. Yes, it has its own firepower, it has its own VLS, it has its own guns, etc. Those are great. But if you consider it, its anti-submarine warfare primary capability is the helicopter. So when you turn around and say, well, you know, Type 45 destroyer, let's give the British example, but, you know, there are other examples, doesn't have anti-submarine warfare capability. Can it carry a Merlin helicopter or Lynx? Yes, then it has anti-submarine warfare capability. Doesn't need a towed array. It would be better if we had a towed array for anti-submarine warfare, but it's not its job. Its job is area air defense and, to an extent, escort leadership of a task group. Leading, commanding their escorts. Towed array, that's the job of a frigate. That's orientated around it. Its hull's orientated, hull shape's orientated around it to give the towed array the best experience. And that also carries a helicopter. So basically, if we add in the helicopters on the carrier, you therefore have all those helicopters added together are the anti-submarine net. And the frigate, frigates, which are providing their towed array sonar, are merely providing, to an extent, long range. And I do emphasize this, long range observation. That's what they're for. A decent frigate with all the computer software it has, all the computer systems it has to utilize that software, all the skilled people it has, and the towed array sonar, it's pretty much the ASW version of airborne early warning. It doesn't have the same range. Please don't confuse it as having the same range. But basically, it's listening for weird things, and then the helicopters are sent to go and inspect that area. And they'll drop their dipping sonar, or sonar buoys, and then they'll prosecute. Is this the sort of system, therefore, I'm talking about for World War II? Highly doubtful. That is a system we have reached as we've evolved over years through the Cold War and various other circumstances. And that is also a reflection of the submarines you're dealing with these days, which can be very, very quiet, these electric submarines, which are basically designed to be, well, to vanish in shallow waters, or relatively shallow waters. Or nuclear submarines, which are designed to be, in a way, ambush predators. They can dash between positions, set themselves up, attack, and dash away again. So, there are differences going to be talked about. Shameless book plug. Now, if you're interested in this book, there is down below a link to a competition where you can there are 2 chances to win autographed and personalized. They'll have a nice little section to you, paragraph, sort of something written to you from me in them, and that is a whole competition this channel's running. So, if you're interested, please go look. I have got to post some of these off, and I will do. But I have got 2 copies of the paperback edition. And these 2 top copies, they are prizes. They are prizes. Well, yeah, they will be prizes. I might swap one of them around with my own copy. They're good books. It's a good topic, and I really loved writing it. And hopefully there'll be more books to follow them soon. But, I don't know. Life keeps interfering. And funding, but life mainly at the moment. So, the benchmark that was used, and if we go back to the question that I was asked about, was it had to be Western Whirlwind equivalent, available in 1939. Well, that's kind of interesting, because technically, the Western Whirlwind, the Chickasaw, the Sikorsky Chickasaw, which it was based on, had its first flight in 1949, 10 years after 1939. So that means I have to move things forward at least 10 years with a historic timeline. Well, thank you. Technically, the Western Whirlwind's first flight is August 1953, and introduced in 54, so arguably, I have to move things forward 15 years. Oh, that's not fair. But then I remembered something. Post-World War II economics versus pre-war economics for Britain. And went, okay, and post-war defense spending versus pre-war defense spending, and I went, oh, that makes life a little bit easier. There might be the 10-year rule on, but there are things I can go with. Plus, there's the American approach pre-war versus post-war. All these are interesting. There were 360 of these built. Well, that's rather nice to know. Okay. What other characteristics are this? We're talking about a helicopter which, with the technology that's been put in it, and this is another thing. During the live, people kept asking, well, what about smaller helicopters? Well, if you want to have the full range of helicopter capabilities, you're talking about a bigger helicopter anyway. You're talking about something which has cabin space. And B, a lot of space in that design is taken up by engine and various other things which have to be accommodated. And to shrink down a helicopter of that period to what we consider a modern style shaping requires a lot of evolution of technology. There's a reason why, if you look at helicopters, there's a bit of a break. Quite a lot of them look very similar in shaping to this. And then about 1970, suddenly they start to change. There is a reason for this. There is a reason for the shaping and the change. There's a reason why the Huey looks like the Huey does. That's earlier. And you have the Super Cobra and things like that. But those are very specialist items because the Huey, let's be honest, when you look into it, it's practically open. It's open space. And that's because they've managed to organize things and reduce the size of things and position things. And it's done really, really well. But that's years of development to get to the Huey. And the Huey is not a Western whirlwind. So please, let's consider that. Performance, 95 knots. Okay. Takeoff weight, 7,800 pounds. Not that bad. Power plant. Single Alvis Leonides Major 755, 14-cylinder, 2-road radial engine with 750 horsepower. Okay. That's a bit more than a Swordfish has, but not a lot more. Not a lot more indeed. There are certainly power plants which fit that profile available in 1939. Do they fit the weight and power to weight ratio? Ooh. It's a close run thing. It's a close run thing. Big, though. Height, 15 foot, 7.5 inches. That's going to have consequences. Most British carriers are a 16 foot high hangar. We'll have to talk about that. We will. Even some of the American ones are going to be tight on that one. Source of basis. Well, Western Whirlwind is not first generation helicopter. In fact, if we're being practical, it's third. Possibly you could argue fourth if you consider this an experimental generation of quadcopter. But actually the change is not that difficult to put in because, thankfully, we have something going on in an age of treaties and all these things which are restricting defense spending and, you know, being used. What happens in the 1920s? There is a naval race. It's over cruisers. Why? Because they can't build capital ships. So it's the whole thing of the Washington Treaty that they finally fix when they realize it gets to the London Treaty. They sort of go, yeah, that was our mistake. We put the whole Washington Treaty to stop a naval arms race, and then we forgot that we put no brake on cruiser construction. So everyone just went and built cruisers. Yeah, we got them to stop building capital ships. They just went and built cruisers. You can imagine the people who believe that the treaties would bring about peace. Arms limitation treaties, unless they are very structured particularly well, and The SALT treaties were a particularly good example of this. Unless they're structured particularly well and they allow for a level of competition and development for people to for those who are worried to focus their energies in and appease their worries, whilst also causing enough stability that those who are worried by the fluidity of events can feel safer, do not work. The naval treaties are a good example of this, that they don't. They don't allow enough level of competition, and they try very hard to be a firm stamp. And it's one of the things which I learnt with the SALT treaties from the naval treaties. That the naval treaties hadn't worked, had created the situation for World War II to actually come about because of the way they've been structured, which had caused a lot of people to feel very afraid. Most classic example is, of course, Japan, which is massively motivated by fear. Some historians like to put Japan down to aggression. It's actually a large, and I would say the larger, overwhelming emotion of Japan is fear. It's fear they are going to lose themselves. It's fear they are too weak. It's fear that they are going to be overwritten by events. It's fear that the past is going to repeat. And this is one of the reasons why it focuses in so much on the Americans, because, of course, the past they're so fearful of is the fleet going into Japan and forcing them to open before they were ready. Yeah, they might never have opened up, but that's their fear in their psyche when they're talking about that, when you've got that leadership. And you have to remember, there's not that big a gap between the leaders in 1940s and the leaders when they were forced to open up to the world. It's not a big gap. Their grandparents, some of them were alive at the time. So, how do I feed into this, all this, and make this happen? Well, it's quite simple. I change where George de Beausart does his first flight, because he does it at McCook Field for the US Army Air Service. And the trouble is for George is that the US Army Air Service gets infected by the same illness, I would say, or rather same affliction, as the Air Ministry of the Royal Air Force does. And it's like, it's similar to the Army Air Corps. It's the US Army Air Service. It's only a small group who really do think everything's about the bomber. And that's the trouble is, again, when you're making the case, the bomber is useful. You cannot argue the bomber is not useful. The bomber is very capable. You cannot argue. But the problem becomes when you believe the bomber is the be-all and end-all, and everything starts and ends with the bomber, and the bomber is all you need to focus on because it's all there is. That's when you get into trouble. Okay? There is the healthy appreciation for the value of bomber aircraft, and there is the unhealthy belief that it is everything, and everything is the bomber. And this is held by a lot of people. This is held by a few. The trouble is a lot of these people get into very senior, very passionate positions. And so Beausart doesn't get much funding. But if we change it from McCook Airfield to Chambers Field, the US Naval Aviation, and we affect William A. Moffett, who is... He is the father of US Naval Aviation. Not grandfather, not everything else. He is the father. He is the parental figure. The major parental figure. Without him, US Naval Aviation would have been nowhere near where it was in 1941. It would have not even been on a par. I'm not sure if even both Lexington and Saratoga would have been completed. There are enough politicians complaining about it. This man is the one-man creation of the US Naval Aviation, and I realise there are others who are involved and they're all important, yes. But the sheer mastery of the dark arts of politics that he puts into creating... People tend to focus on the people and they go, well, this one does the engineering, this one sets up this. They do. But none of that would have been possible if it hadn't been for this man going and managing to somehow persuade senators who didn't want to fund a frigging thing to actually open up the wallet and spend some money. I mean, the sheer amount of moths he must have had to wade through alone But anyway, he gets, in about the same period, really obsessed in 1920, the early 1920s, 21 and 23, obsessed with airships, which is what leads to the dirigible developments and, unfortunately, the accident which kills him, the USS Akron, which is a whole nother scenario, because if he survives, there is odds-on chance he becomes Chief of Naval Operations. And there are people going to disagree with this, but let me put it this way. There is no one more politically connected who's a Rear Admiral in the US Navy than he is. Yes, he should probably have a seagoing command before he gets it. But in the nicest way, that could well have been arranged for him. In fact, when he died, it was already in the discussions for him. So, him getting a seagoing command has commanded one of the fleets, he would be Chief of Naval Operations. He dies in 1933. If he'd done 3 years as a fleet commander, he probably would have then been Chief of Naval Operations for until you managed to either him out. Which means he might be in charge rather than King. Now that's an interesting thought. But leave that all to one side. Basically, what we're changing is this, instead of taking place on a US Army airfield, takes place on a US Navy airfield, in front of Moffett, and Moffett gets obsessed. And Moffett goes, I love them. And with Moffett loving them, well, if Moffett loves helicopters and is investing in them, who is going to respond? That's the question. Who will respond? The British. And the Japanese. Both will want to respond to this. In Japan, there'll probably be a fight over the army and the army and the navy probably want to develop each their own, because they're like that. The moment the navy starts developing something, the army's going to want their own version. So that's going to put more fun and put even more pressure on the poor limited Japanese infrastructure and industry. But they'll go for it. We're talking 1920, so they're going to be pushing into it, and the British will as well. And for the British, there's all sorts of interesting scenarios, because if it's being developed by the Navy for naval communications for seaplanes and replace float planes or seaplanes, well, for the Royal Navy, that's always an interesting area of development, because for quite a long time, that's actually the area which the Navy has the most control over. The Air Force, the Air Ministry, is very keen to retain control over the units on aircraft carriers. They see them as the most direct threat to their power. But, when it comes to the stuff flying off from capital ships and cruisers, which, let's be honest, is where the helicopters will be most useful, initially as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, they'll probably very quickly find themselves on carriers, but initially it's going to be the cruisers and the capital ships. Well, honestly, they'd probably like to get rid of that. Honestly, the Air Ministry would like. And the thing is, it's just far enough out of the norm for the Air Ministry's works. Yes, they are involved in some developments, etc. Just far enough out of the norm, the Navy might actually be able to set it up. So kind of like they retain control of the observers, and they are still part of the Royal Navy. And one of the interesting things about the Royal Navy, observers, by the way, are navigator / communications officer / spotter / all the naval specialisms that sits in the second seat of the torpedo spotter reconnaissance, i.e. the Swordfish or various other aircraft. They're all Royal Navy. So, as they're allowed to all be, they're all Royal Navy because it's a Royal Navy specialism, and the Royal Navy shamelessly picks people who are very, very smart for that role. And then they're where the Royal Navy gets a lot of their developments of their doctrine and their approach to naval aviation, how they manage and run naval aviation in World War II, has come from the experience of the observers and the observers going up the ranks. Because, again, the Royal Navy has complete control of their promotions, whereas the pilots are dual ranked, and they have both a flying rank, which is bestowed by the Air Ministry, and a naval rank, and quite often those two do not match up in any way, shape or form, and that causes all sorts of problems. All sorts of problems. But like the observers, you could see them basically go, right, we're going to ignore these people. They're Navy, that's Royal Navy. And then the Royal Navy would therefore have a source of pilots. Okay, not fighter pilots, but they have their own pilot training program. They'd have their own aero engineers. They'd have all those things, and they have connections with the companies. which could lead to all sorts of interesting developments, including more enhanced engines being developed and engines being funded more because the Navy would be involved in it. Which would be interesting. It would be really interesting. But that's completely off the topic for today, because that's going so many different permutation routes. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not getting into World War II, because there are so many different options for this. Now, if you consider, really these are second generation. Second gen helicopters. And I think the primary competition you'd have would be Britain and America, but I wouldn't be surprised if the helicopters end up looking very similar. Because I wouldn't be surprised. Because you do have a similar process going. It's one of those fun things with the American, and I try and explain this a few times. This is how serious the competition is between Britain and America. Prior to World War I, and even post-World War I. One of the biggest yards in Britain is run by an American, John Brown Yard. It's one of the biggest, most important yards. It's run by an American. There are American naval architects over in Britain. There are British naval architects over in America. There are American aero engineers over working in Britain. There are British aero engineers working across in America. There are, for countries which, according to some histories and historians have put, are on the brink of war, one would think that the first thing would be, why are we building very secure, very secret things in yards which are run by people who are foreign nationals of the nation state we're worried about? Try hunting for yards run by a German in the UK, or even in America. And when I say German, I don't mean someone whose family are of German origins. I know there is a strand in America which does go with, oh, we were 4 generations ago this, that, or the other. I'm sorry, that doesn't really... Where I come from, that's interesting, but I can understand that to an extent. But what I'm talking about is, those people are not really foreign nationals. Yes, your great-great-grandparent might have been German or Irish or English or whatever, but you're de facto you're American, as far as national security goes. You're not likely to start selling secrets, whereas someone who is literally born, raised in Britain, still has family in Britain, hasn't become a green card citizenship or anything like that, being the senior architect, senior marine engineer in your yard, building your ships. Yeah, that's a very trusted position. If you're seriously thinking you're likely to go to war with that nation, you wouldn't have them anywhere near there. You'd find a way to get rid of them. It might be done quietly. They might be promoted. Might be swapped to, offered a deal which they cannot refuse. So much money to go operate there. That there are so many options for quietly getting rid of such people in such positions without causing a big stir, big fluff, and raising tensions. They would be gone. So my own personal view is that whatever race develops, and a race would develop, the British and American entrants would not be a million miles from each other. They would not be. They would be a competition point, but they would not be a million miles away. What would they be looking for developing? Well, the first helicopters, I have this feeling, are going to be spotter reconnaissance assets for things like cruisers and capital ships. And possibly for sloops. The Royal Navy might well look at the treaty limits and go, well, we can operate from sloops from them. Operate them from sloops. Put 3 of them on sloops. And actually, when you consider it, you're limited in terms of your launching equipment, etc., and how many catapults and all sorts of things you can put on auxiliaries under the Washington Treaty and under the First London Treaty and the Washington Treaty to an extent. You can get around all of that. You can get around all of that with helicopters. So, what are we going to see? What's the likely timeline? Well, I'm going to guess first generation would enter service about 1930. Maybe 1929, just before the London Treaty, but probably just about the same time as it. The thing that's going to be interesting there is how you modify ships, because remember the ships are being built with seaplanes in mind, but you're sending some ships into big modernizations and upgrades. At that time. You're talking about capital ships going in for upgrades, you're talking about cruiser builds, all these things. So that's going to start having an impact about 1930. Again, I'm going to emphasize this, I do not think, considering the text of the London Treaties, you are going to get helicopters added onto destroyers. I have a reason for this. Before anyone starts being very upset with me, I have a reason for this. Think about the fact that with destroyers, there's always a fight between torpedoes and guns over which you have them. Add in now a helicopter, and all the stuff for that. You've got a limited weight tonnage, you want to have a fast, viable, general-purpose combatant. With all the guns it needs for its job, and the helicopter, and the torpedoes it needs for its job. Adding in helicopter and all the stuff for that, that's just not going to be the case. However, I could see both the Americans going down a similar route as the British with sloops, or cutters, perhaps they'd call them, like because they probably share a design with the Coast Guard. I can imagine would also be having helicopter-based vessels. And the British could modify their sloop designs, because the sloops, A, are limited to 2,000 tons, which is a far higher tonnage. They aren't supposed to go faster than supposed to be designed to go no faster than 20 knots. Okay, they honestly can go no faster than 20 knots. They're honestly not designed to go faster than 20 knots. Some very interesting maths on some sloop journeys, but we'll leave that to one side. And they're not allowed to carry torpedoes. Suddenly you have the perfect thing to fit helicopters on. And that'll do. And why are you doing that? Well, you see, what I can see happening very quickly is the British already have anti-submarine bombs they drop, and the idea of dropping depth charges from aircraft. And so the first anti-submarine helicopters will probably be the spotter helicopters, wandering around in an exercise, and they'll try it out. And then they'll go, ooh, that's kind of nice. That's kind of useful. What can we build? We can build as many of these under 2,000 ton ships as we want. So test it out. Test out the designs. Build them. They're cheap. Sloops are really cheap. It's another thing which comes up on this channel quite often, and I try and explain, is that for defense spending in 1930s, sloops are don't even register really as a percent of the budget in terms of their cost. You're talking very low down the cost element of how much the government is prepared to spend on defence. And when they're not affected by treaty limitations, realistically, the things which limit their construction numbers are the Admiralty's own decisions about how to spend its money and how much money they're given by the Treasury. Well, with this is another add-on to their role. They already are the mine warfare assets, they already are the anti-submarine warfare specialists, they're the convoy escort specialists, they're the... When I say mine warfare, I mean both clearing and laying. They're diplomatic tools for doing presence missions. Yeah, add on helicopters. Why not? Which does lead to an interesting position of, do they end up with an all-forward armament? Kind of like a sort of Nelrod almost style scenario of their guns all forward and the hangar and flight deck aft. I don't think that happens. I don't think that happens. I think probably what you end up with is maybe the main guns forward and air defense guns on the hangar or something like that, but that's probably sort of the structure you go for. And the hangar will probably be interesting. You're probably also going to see that the sloops are going to change slightly in shape. They're going to get slightly beamier, for want of a better phrase, fatter, because of accommodating aircraft landing and trying to make it as easy as possible for helicopters to land on the aft. I also think they probably designed for a pair of them. Why? Why am I saying pair of helicopters? Well, I think it's 2 to 3. Maybe even 4, but at least 2. And the reason I'm saying that is because you would need that many. You would need that many to be able to guarantee availability with the level of serviceability of aircraft at this time period. Now again, the British tend to carry more supplies, the Americans tend to carry more spare aircraft. That's how they tend to roll, which is why Americans tend to have large numbers of volumes of aircraft carried because they stow them up. The Japanese are similar, they do similar things to the Americans, but it's partially assembled aircraft. The British tend to carry more spare parts and try and refit their aircraft because they think that's more efficient with space and it's more efficient with their numbers of personnel and the way they design their carriers, because they design them as internal things, because realistically it's because they lose so many aircraft over the side in the North Sea and the North Atlantic in World War I and in the 1920s. This is what makes many people come with all sorts of reasons and colourful ideas for why the British, go for enclosed hangars and don't have them the same as the Americans and Japanese, because it's less efficient space-wise, because you can fit more aircraft in an open hangar and you can do more. Yes, it is, but the British find that the North Sea and North Atlantic likes to go yonk with their aircraft. And they get fed up losing their aircraft, so they end up going the enclosed system. And it also adds on extra protection against enemy fire. There's all sorts of good reasons you can come up with, but honestly, when you start reading admirals' reports and admirals are complaining about attriting aircraft being attrited to the sea, by the sea just nicking them off the carrier, you start to get the idea that, yeah, the Royal Navy didn't like open side hangars for that reason. For the Americans, well, if they really push and if Moffat's involved, then something else might appear before even the 1930 London Naval Treaty. Because I said 1930, I think first generation probably enters service of aircraft into service. That's probably the second generation of helicopters, but the first generation into service of things. I wouldn't be surprised if something like this gets built beforehand. And it's going to be different, because what it will be is probably a hangar and flight deck aft and guns forward. It's going to be kind of like some of the Japanese designs, but that's going to work. It will provide them with a carrier, with a cruiser which can provide reconnaissance and presence, and also can, to an extent, fight in the battle line. And unlike this, it's not going to be a huge stab-sided target, because you can arrange things. You don't have to have a full-length flight deck. You don't have to have all those weird alignments. You can have proper air defense. It can look like a regular cruiser forward. It might just have 3 turrets forward. You could even see it going maybe the French route. It might even be a scenario, especially the Americans, when they're looking at their 8-inch cruisers and their 3 triple 8-inch guns, that they have the 2 turrets forward, A, B, then they have the turret often Y, and then where X position would normally be, they have a flight deck, and they have a hangar, and that's where the helicopter goes. I could see that becoming quite a common thing. But I can see flight deck cruisers being a big part of developments of helicopters, if helicopters come in earlier, because it makes things a lot easier. You can operate them, you don't have to recover them, you don't have to stop to recover them. It makes life a lot safer. It provides you with an anti-submarine warfare capability in terms of spotting, in terms of wandering around looking for submarines, but also provides you with a reconnaissance capability and a beyond visual range reconnaissance ability, which is very good for the Americans. Very, very good for the Americans. It's good for the British. The British will be really excited with it for dealing with surface raiders and all those things. But for the Americans, who are thinking about the whole island approaches, the whole across the Pacific run, the ability to be able, for all their ships which are out solo, to be able to get a view and look around them and go, oh, what the frigate is that? That's going to be useful. And the thing is with helicopters, I see it as a scenario whereby you will end up with more funding going in as time goes on. So basically, they're going to start off as going to be Moffat's experiment. Then other people are going to get involved in it about here. And then they're going to start, that's going to cause competition and extra funding. And then they're going to find they're actually useful things. And that's going to cause the funding to grow. And go and grow and grow. And then that's going to go up. And so, rather like happened historically. Historically, that's what happened with helicopters. They started off playing with them, they didn't know what they were for, and then they found them to be useful, and then they go, woo! And then they found them useful for even more things, because the more you have them, the more useful they are. The more you go, oh, we can do this with them, we can do that with them, we can do troop transport, we can do all sorts of options. You can do counter minesweeping operations if you really want to with them. That's what the US Navy does with some of theirs. It's an interesting system. But that's the point. The more you use them, the more you play around them, the more useful they're going to be. And as said, the RN. Do they go to helicopter cruiser route? The thing is, I can see them doing it, but it's going to be really interesting. It's going to be the Town class. Okay? The Town class were the independent reconnaissance cruisers. And they're the ones really built around aviation. They become the model for the Royal Navy's cruisers going on. And one of the interesting questions I had when I started working on this is what happens to the fourth turret. Because very quickly I came to the idea that the Americans were right, and the free turret, the free gun arrangement, that will be right, and that came out to design of X position. And I thought, well, that's a good idea, but what are the Brits going to do? Because the Brits like the fourth turret on the Town class. And there are lots of other designs which like the fourth turret, but, the Brits really are for turrets. They do like that idea. They drop it due to war necessities at certain points, but they really like the four turret idea. The balanced ends. Oh, that just became something to think about. Would they go for a midships turret? So they get their fourth turret? Do they go for a midships helicopter system? Well, if they do, that's going to cause trouble, because of the mast, etc., that means the helicopter's going to have to dip in from the side and take off to the side. You can do that. You can do that. It's a perfectly feasible operation. It's a lot more complicated. There are winds or issues, etc., but you can also take off with a bit of protection of wind, but you can end up in accidents more often. And that's why we have got the R system has become pretty much universally adopted, because of safety criteria. Of course, the British later do work on a quadruple 6-inch turret, which doesn't really work out in time, so that's why they go with the triple turret for Belfast and Edinburgh. So that would have been an option, maybe, to get them to 12 guns. As I thought about it more and more, I decided you'd go with the Tiger concept. The Tiger, HMS Tiger as in the battle cruiser, not HMS Tiger as in the cruiser, and would have a sort of mid-turret. The reason I thought about this was, again, I was thinking through what experience will they have in operation of helicopters, and they'll gain experience rather rapidly. They'll have probably tried various approaches in terms of the Leander class, Amphion class, and Arethusa class. Probably will have tried various approaches then. Probably will be trying approaches with the counties as well. Sorry. Brain went dead. For some reason I was going to call the counties the Crown Colonies. I don't know why, but I apologise. The counties as well. But, and this is the glorious glutamus maximus of buts, very quickly the British are going to realise there's a problem, and the most efficient way of operating. And the thing is, they want to have this efficient because it's an advantage. Whoever spots the enemy first gets to define the terms of combat. Defining the terms of combat allows you to define the battle to best suit you, giving you the best chance of winning, or at least surviving. The British are obsessed with fighting outnumbered and outgunned, because despite being legally, according to treaty, one of the two largest navies in the world, both are supposed to be tied, realistically being the largest navy in the world because of the US Congress and its desire to not fund it. It's happy with the paper, we are equal to the British and second to none. They don't have to then feel like they actually have to invest in anything. The Royal Navy looks at its global empire and the Commonwealth and all the other things it's defending that are sort of combined together. I'm using Commonwealth as a catch-all for Dominions and all the other weird things they have going on. And Empire, all the stuff together, they have to defend. The trade routes they have to defend, and thinks that when war starts, there is no chance they will have the overwhelming force in the right place at the right time. Unless it's been telegraphed a long time in advance, they've been able to move the stuff there. So they're always worried about fighting outnumbered. So they want to be able to set the terms of battle. That means information is critical. Acquisition of information is critical. For the town class, which are honestly not surface raiders, Governor, they are entirely developed with an idea and reference on being counter-surface raiders. The fact that being a counter-surface raider leads you to pretty much the same development sphere as surface raiders will leave to one side. They're developed to counter it. Information is critical. So I do think they end up with the flight deck in exposition, and probably like they were historically designed. Historically, they were designed to take 4 aircraft for that reason. They end up mostly carrying around with 2 and 1 boxed, but they were designed to take 4 aircraft because of the need for maintaining those aircraft and for what happens if those aircraft break. To guarantee they have the reconnaissance ability. So I'm only surprised if they end up with the ability to carry at least 4 helicopters. And a hangar designed around that. Although, as far as standard tonnage limits, they'll be probably described as carrying 2. It's empty space. But yeah, the Iron will go the helicopter cruiser route, probably similar to the Americans. The Japanese definitely end up going down that route. Admittedly, they'll probably want the range of the seaplanes, because I doubt the helicopters are going to have the equivalent range of the seaplanes, especially not early on. But the advantages of the helicopters outweigh the disadvantages. Starters for the British is going to be a communications issue. They're going to be able to physically get from ship to ship without the ships pausing, without the ships doing anything really special. They can just carry on as normal and they can launch from position to position and get there. That's useful. Again, they don't have the range, but if you're talking about wandering around a task force, think about it from Cunningham's perspective. If he can personally go and visit every cruiser and above in an afternoon and check on the crews while they're at sea, he would do that. Vian, there are occasions he'd probably visit he'd probably visit some of his cruisers and possibly remonstrate strongly with captains. But, you know, the fact is, for Royal Navy admirals, the ability to wander around ships would be enough alone to entice them to the whole idea of the helicopter, let alone the diplomatic capabilities of it. Now, if we've got a town-class cruiser, HMS Birmingham, involved in the Tsingtao incident, as she was in 1939, January 1939, with the SS Vincent de Paul, which I've talked about again a lot on this channel, but one of the things I'm trying to do is reference other videos so you can go for further information if you want to, but this is a very big topic to try and fit in. And I can either spend so much time on a minutiae I never get anywhere, or I can almost go, reference other videos. Go and find out more information. So that's scenario. The British could have leapt ahead of their ships even arriving in harbour and had deployed a midshipman's team on the Vincent de Paul before they even got into harbour. They could have secured the merchant vessel before they even got out of harbour. They could have sent people forward to meet with the Japanese before they even got into harbour. They could have shown intent before they ever exposed their cruiser and sloop to risk. At this point, I was thinking, right then, the Royal Navy's secret weapons, it would be Langley and Argus which would be testing out the helicopters massively. But then I thought about it. Well, Langley might well get away with it, but Argus is actually going to be a bit tight. She's famously big and capable and is used for fixed-wing, has big hangars and is used for fixed-wing aviation. Certainly, you know, when you've got Hurricanes and etc. being stowed in her, certainly she has the space to do that. But for a helicopter, she's actually maybe a little bit short. Because the helicopters are going to be quite so high. You want at least 2 foot of clearance. And that gets me down to another interesting area of discussion. It does. And if I skip ahead to this point, changes in design, I'll get back to the other. It really does when we start talking about carrier design, because when we start to consider the British mostly going for 16 foot 6 inches, the Americans, well, if we consider they're 17 foot 6 inches, but if you're talking about helicopters which have a height of 15 foot 7.5 inches, that gives you less than a, well, let's be honest, for the British, less than a foot of space on even HMS Unicorn to be able to lift up and move around rotors. That's going to be tight. And whilst the Americans can be going, well, you know, we have nearly 2 foot of space on the Essexes. No. Lexingtons are going to indulge them, but they're going to very quickly realise they need them. I think both will end up with roughly 18-foot hangars, which has all sorts of consequences for World War II and all sorts of things. You know, the whole idea of aircraft being built with little wingtips which do that. Move in the camera. Because the hangar's too low, just as it's going to happen, they'll be just doing that because they have the space. As the British also have their own 20-foot hangar, which is HMS Eagle, which is probably going to be even more useful at this point, because if you're developing and working on helicopters, and that's a Westland Wessex, by the way, up there, which is the successor to the Whirlwind, it's what comes after it, and that's even taller. You're going to want space to be able to lift things up and muck around, and for people to get in there physically. If you want someone to physically go and check, I'm going to call it by its name, the Jesus nut, which is the bolt which holds the rotor physically holds the rotor onto the helicopter. You want someone to be free and easy to inspect that properly. Because if that goes, you go through the pearly gates so fast, you don't stop for St. Peter, you reach Jesus' feet. You want that checked properly. You don't want the person checking it to be going, oh, I just got my head in and sort of space. You want them to be able to get up and look at it and have plenty of light to check it. To be sure, from all angles, it is fine. You do not want them having to do that on the flight deck. Because if they're having to do it on the flight deck, when the ship is doing all that, they're going to be high up, and it's not a good position if the ship's moving. So, you want that in the hangar, where even if it is moving, it's going to feel less movement. It's going to feel more so. You're going to not have a horizon dipping up and down in your peripheral vision, which is what can make you feel unwell. You're going to be able to just feel the movement, but not see the movement. So you can concentrate. So 18 foot. 18 foot is what I'm thinking, okay, for the hangar. Which is going to affect carrier design. All the carriers are going to have to be taller. You know, we're talking about some carriers in this list have two hangars. Unicorn does. Ark Royal does. They have double hangars. So if they go up from 16 foot 6 inches to 18 foot, well, that's a 3-foot height change. He's going to be 3 foot higher for Unicorn. Ark Royal is going to be roughly 4 foot higher. And some people then came back and went, well, you know, what about the space between the rafters? Surely that helps. The rafters and those positions up there are what are used as cranes. Can you see a jerry crane wandering across that ceiling? No. So they're using the rafters in the position. So those are the positions which they're going to be able to using for picking stuff up. So they're also the positions they use for securing things and maintaining them. You need to think about all this when you're designing the ship. It's going to have an impact on the carrier designs, which means the carriers are going to change. Which is another reason why I can't predict really into World War II, because the carriers, if they're going to be caught this, they're going to have to work out that much higher. The armoured deck on the Illustrious class is going to be that much higher. Which might mean they actually go with the deck edge rather than the centerline lifts. Because when they were looking at that, they felt they can make, if they moved the lifts out and were using the deck edge system, they could then rearrange some of the internals. They didn't need to. It was considered more expensive to go that way. But weight-wise, that might work, which is going to change the Illustrious class completely if they got deck edge lifts. That changes their profile completely. So all sorts of things change. And these vessels will no doubt be used for testing, but I think HMS Eagle is going to be used for testing very quickly by the British, far more. In fact, Eagle might end up not being so much the generator of the strike carrier knowledge to an extent, and some of the fleet and definitely the fleet carrier knowledge. Courageous and Glorious, once they're in service, take over the strike carrier development role, and they're really core for that. Furious and Eagle then become the fleet carrier templates and are used for developing a lot of the fleet carrier ideas the Royal Navy either comes up with. But I think Eagle will probably be doing that more than Argus because of her size. And that then leads us to World War II. What's this going to affect me? Well, for starters, bases like Scarpa, Flow and other bases are going to have helicopters wandering around them. It's going to be a cheap, easy way to add extra patrols and presence. Now, I don't know if the helicopter has any impact on the sinking of the Royal Oak. It could have the effect on it in two ways. One, helicopters wandering around could notice the deterioration of the defences, which could mean they could be dealt with earlier. Two, they could spot the submarine coming in. That's quite a possibility. And will there be helicopters wandering around? I have no doubt. It's a very easy way to secure it for the Royal Navy. It's a very easy way for them to secure Gibraltar and the entrance to the Mediterranean, because again, if you have some helicopters who exist in Gibraltar literally for the purpose of patrolling the straits, you can do that. And they'll be able to look down, and let's be honest, the water is shallow enough that if the submarine is close enough to the surface, they can see it when it's underneath the surface. Let alone once you have air-to-surface radar developed. The whole scenario changes. Again, you've got the changes of what happens. We talked about I just mentioned helicopter designs, but if helicopters are if helicopters are being used by carriers for anti-submarine warfare, does Courageous get sunk? Does she not? Does Glorious get sunk? Well, Glorious, there's all sorts of... Mainly, she seems to be heading home for some reason. Okay, well, I'm going to settle that. I have my personal views, but there are people discussing all sorts of options. But even if you go with the most strange idea, which is only, to my mind, possible because Lord Corkenori is the admiral in charge out there, and frankly, he is not really who I would consider behaving like he had earlier in his career. He's one of those officers who was very good earlier in his career, excellent in World War One. In World War Two, he's really not... How do I put this? He's not living up to his reputation. And it's sad in a way. But he's also really annoying at that point. And Maybe she is doing a strike. I doubt it, though. The whole maths doesn't add up for me. But leaving that to one side. Well, you wouldn't have the helicopters wouldn't be involved in the strike. They'd be still be doing up patrolling. And a helicopter would be up high enough. It would see Shah North and Eisenhower from a long way away. And broadcast everywhere that it had seen them. For starters, that means any capital ship in the area is going to get alerted and go, "Ooh! Dinner is that way!" Sorry, I slipped into HMS Warspite voice. Renown! Warspite will probably be running quite quickly. But also, Shah North and Eisenhower might have their own helicopters up. The whole thing is, it's going to provide a lot more warning and a lot more discussion. It's going to change things dramatically. That changes World War II. We can go to the same with Ark Royal. A, she's probably built with 18-foot high hangars. And B, she's probably got helicopters. Again, does that change whether the submarine gets closer? We don't know. It adds in so many different variables we don't know. To work it all out and put it all in would require more computing power than I have available. And would require more people and skill sets than I have available to really work this out. I'd love to. But we'd be talking engineers, historians, and a team of about 100 people probably to try and work this all out. Because you'd be fundamentally rewriting history. It would be beyond alternate history, which is what I tend to look into, and I tend to use as a way to examine current events and try and learn about the history actually happened, why it happened the way it is. And once you realise that helicopters weren't there, and that makes a lot of reasons for why they're doing the things they're doing. Because all that's compensating for something they don't realise they could have had. Pearl Harbor is another area where it could be dramatically changed if you've got helicopters up for anti-submarine warfare patrols. They could spot the flights coming in and send out warnings. It doesn't take more than a few seconds. A minute or so's warning that there's Japanese striker groups coming in, and suddenly you change the scenario greatly. You can have fighters launching, you can have guns all crewed by the time they're coming in. There's no surprise at that point. Or rather, it's still a surprise, but it's a surprise of, they're coming! We're in position! They're here! Rather than they're here! Surprise. It's a difference. Amphibious warfare development. This is something the Royal Navy, I can imagine, would get into very quickly. Very, very quickly. And how it affects Norway, how it affects commando operations, how it affects the approach to the Atlantic Wall. It's just, who knows? It's just so many different options. They could be is it going to change aviation warfare? Probably. Will there be air mobile brigades in fighting in World War II? I doubt there'll be an air mobile brigade. But there could be something similar to it. I could certainly see officers like Carlton de Weert from the army going, how many troops can we load in your helicopters? How many helicopters do we have? Where can you drop us off? And that's just in the British Army. There are definitely officers in the American Army who would be doing the same. And probably in the German Army, there's a couple. Quite a lot of them tend to be quite focused on refighting World War I, but there's a fair few who are quite keen on other things, so yeah. It would change all these things, because suddenly you have a very accurate vertical lift movement system. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you can say, you will pick the troops up here, and you will deposit them here. And they will be there. It's not like parachute, where they come in pretty much anywhere around that area and have to group up. They will be deposited as a unit there. It's not like gliding, where you have a crash. and then disembark from the glider. You're deposited there. Yes, if they're trying to take tanks and, well, light tanks and vehicles with them, they're probably still going to be using gliders, because I doubt helicopters get big enough to start transporting personnel in that time. Well, more than personnel and their equipment in that time, but still, it's going to change everything on that front. And it's a complicated enough scenario to think through that you're going to have to do a lot of work to figure out what. It's going to depend on the exact attributes of the helicopters involved. And for this, I tend to start thinking of the Western Wessex, because my theory is most of World War II, what you see is first generation is roughly the 1939 aircraft, second generation is the 1941-42 aircraft, and third generation World War II are the 44-45 aircraft, and that's sort of roughly what you can. You've got roughly 3 generations of aircraft in World War II, roughly. That's a rule of thumb, rough assessment, okay? Before anyone starts going, no, this aircraft entered in 1943 and this one entered in. Yeah, it's a rough one. Well, for that regard, you don't have to think, well, they're starting with something which is whirlwind equivalent. What's the successor to the whirlwind? The Wessex. Now, the Wessex is again based on the Choctaw, which is the H-34 by Sikorsky. And it's a good helicopter. It's a good, really cool helicopter. In fact, the Wessex was in service for a very, very long time. But the Wessex is powered by de Havilland Gnomes, which are turboprop engines. And they give 1,350 shaft horsepower each. But again, that's something which is, I don't know, for the jet developments, etc. going on. Now, normally, I would sit here and go, well, at that point, you're getting out of the spectrum, because we've talked about helicopters being developed, not engines, and we haven't included any jet engine development. But the problem is with this, it's because helicopters are going to be even more dependent on the power of that power plant and its power-to-weight ratio than even the single-engined aircraft which the Fleet Air Armies can consistently involved with. And if you consider the Royal Navy's first thing on getting control of the Fleet Air Arm in 1937, the Inskip Award, the first thing they really do with it, and they got it fully by 1939, but it's pretty much 1937 onwards, the first thing they do is turn around and order the development of engines which leads to the 2,000 horsepower engines, the Sabre and the Griffin, because they need that power. They need that horsepower. 1,000 horsepower doesn't really work for a naval aircraft. 2,000 horsepower engine starts to make it more viable because of the extra weight they need to carry. Because they need to carry extra survival gear and all sorts of things. Because they're flying over ocean, which is nowhere for you to go and nicely sit until you're recovered. You are literally going into the drink. Anything you don't bring with you, you ain't got. And it's drink you can't drink, because it'll literally make you ill. I'm using literally a lot today. I don't think I've watched Clueless recently. Anyway, moving on from that, this means that engine development, especially if the Royal Navy and the US Navy are having a bit of a competition, is going to be even primarily more important. Which means they could well have got power plants or capabilities that will give them that shaft horsepower. I cannot predict. It's too many permutations. There are too many variations going on here. This is going to have such a wide impact. But again, I think something that can carry 16 troops is probably what they'd be aiming for. It's something what would be sort of level. And the Wessex, the Whirlwinds carry a few troops as well. So they would be working on this. They'd be working on this idea. The more capable the aircraft get, the more capable you're going to need them to get, because the more you're going to think about what you can use them for. And that leads us to the Axis formation, because again, they are going to be developing their own. I mean, this is going to have a big impact on submarines, and I would like to point out with convoys, I haven't really got into convoys, I discussed it sort of at the beginning in a way offside, but I honestly do believe you'd end up with convoys which are based around a couple of sloops, each with 2 to 4 helicopters on them, and a converted merchant vessel, possibly even the merchant vessel which is being used as the convoy Commodore's flagship. and that would have a hangar and a flight deck stuck on top of it. You don't need to have the full-length flight deck. You don't need to have lifts. You don't need to have anything. Nothing complicated. You can literally put it all. And the structure you build above the main deck, maybe to stick that all on, is going to provide accommodation space and store space and fuel storage for all those systems. Fine, that's done. And that can have 8 to 16 helicopters in it. Because again, they're not going to be massive things. And maybe you have one of those, maybe you have 2 of those in a convoy. I think you could probably get away with just 1. Because especially if you have good maintenance going on, and you have overall between the sloops and them, you have 16 helicopters wandering around, and some corvettes or something else wandering around providing extra escort around it. You have suddenly a very good example of what's going to happen to submarines. In that you have something that can visibly deter them. The submarine has a choice. It fights it out with the helicopter on the surface, which it might do because the helicopter's probably going to be dealing with it far. It's not going to carry as many bombs as a Sunderland flying boat or something like that. But it could be carrying rockets, which could give it a standoff range. It could be carrying depth. It probably is carrying depth charges, so if they do slip below water, it can drop them. And so they might want to fight it. But the thing is, they might win the fight with one helicopter. But then the problem is not going to be the one helicopter. It's going to be, you will have, let's say you have 16 helicopters overall in the task force. So you'll probably have 4 of those airborne at one time. You start a fight with one. The 2 others on the patrol are going to keep positioning to watch for other ones of your U-boat friends. One of the others is going to come over and join it, and the alert helicopters, which there might be another 4 of, are going to lift off and head in your direction. You're not going to be fighting 1. You're going to be very quickly dealing with 6. And you might win the fight versus the first one, but that's just going to make the next 5 annoyed with you. And you're not there to fight helicopters, you're there to try and sink merchant vessels. But that's going to have effects, because if the Germans lose more submarines in the 1939-1940 period, that's going to delay their expansion for 1941. If their submarines aren't as successful as they are in 1941, then Hitler already does the unthinkable in that he basically cancels his entire surface fleet, his large surface vessels, and basically gets rid of them. Or just makes them floating artillery batteries and air defense batteries towards the end of the war, because he decides they're not value for money. Well, if the submarines aren't even delivering, what's he going to do? Is he going to pay for the stuff that develops the Type 22s and those things? No, he's not. All those submarines, the Type 21s, just aren't going to. I keep calling them 22, sorry. I was writing a paper on Type 22s earlier. The Type 21 subs and all those things, they're just not going to be developed. They're not going. I can see it having that effect already, because the submarines won't be as successful initially, and they'll lose more people initially. And that's before we get on to the idea of Warspite with 3 or 4 of those helicopters wandering around her during Narvik. Because let's be honest, the torpedoes aren't working during the Narvik, third battle of Narvik. I know someone's going to go second battle. No, first battle of Narvik was the Germans versus the Norwegians. Second battle was the H-class coming in. Third battle was the Tribals. Honourable mention from other destroyers of the Royal Navy and HMS Warspite going in. Well, imagine you've got a couple of helicopters up. She historically managed to launch 1 float plane, because she's only carrying 1 float plane. Because again, they don't like to stop to recover them. Launches it to provide forward reconnaissance as she's going in, and spot what's in. 2 or 3 helicopters, that doesn't have to stop to recover them, so launch them all. One of those will probably be reconnaissance for the force going far ahead. One will be spotting for Warspite and her guns. And one will probably be doing tail end Charlie, watching for submarines. So now if a submarine fires a torpedo at Warspite, there's probably someone going, "You fired at my ship!" It didn't work. That's good. I'm coming to see you now. And when you look at the submarines which do fire at Warspite, they are crewed by some of the people who go on to be very, very good submariners for the German Navy in World War II. You lose them, you lose a lot of people who do a lot of the training as well of their submariners in World War II. All sorts of permutations come from this. And of course, the Germans will probably have helicopters. The Italians will probably have helicopters. Goodness knows what effect that'll have on the Mediterranean. Because again, if the British and the Americans are pushing on it, it's not going to happen in isolation. It's going to be visible enough. Yes, the Germans probably won't start work on them until after Hitler comes to power. It's really not going to happen before that. But long before that, the fat boy, fun boy of Italy, Mussolini, will be pushing straight on with it. Which means you could have seen helicopters being part of the Spanish Civil War. This is a real factor in development of these aircraft. The earlier they come about, the bigger the impact they're going to have. The more they're going to be built into things. And I picked a Merlin crow's nest fit for a reason here. Surface search radar and airborne early warning. These are things which take a while to get round to. Yes, centimetric radar, etc., which is used for airborne early warning as a rule, will probably take longer. But one of the things that I would point out is that a lot of the issues with airborne early warning radar and other radars, when they were developing them and trying to look at them in the late 1930s, was where you had the aircraft versus where you had the scientists and the engineers. A helicopter can go straight up, turn on its system, see what's going on around it, and report back. It has a cab which can have people in. Even if we go back to the very beginning, actually it's probably easier for us to click through this way because it's closer. Even go back to this one. There's a cab there. That's far more spacious. Far easier to put stuff in. Far easier to protect it from the rain than a swordfish. And again, that's probably going to have an effect on aircraft design as well, because the design of helicopters is going to have an impact on aircraft design in the period. So you might end up with swordfish with a canopy. The permutations of things that happen and change with this are massive. And as said, and as I've tried to make repeatedly, it didn't happen. And it didn't happen primarily because it would have taken a lot of work and a lot of focus. And at the original time, they weren't looked at as seriously. They just weren't. And we can sit here and we can argue all we like with that idea, but think about that. You are a couple of decades to 20 years away from when the humans first took flight. You've seen all the changes you've seen. And now someone's telling you that that's something which throws its wings around, which is where the original fling wing, I think, comes from, rather than rotary wing. Literally flings it around, is going to be able to be safe to be airborne, and is going to be practical for useful military operations. That's a big ask. Especially when you're dealing with organizations which are, by their very nature, small c conservative. Let me explain that. If you muck up in charge of the armed forces, your whole country could get wiped out. At worst. At best, probably a lot of people get killed who are in your services. That makes you very risk adverse in your procurement. It makes you unlikely to go down something which is not proven, which you don't have absolute faith is going to work. Unless you are you're an incredibly corrupt individual. So outside of that circumstance, you are going to go down a route which you honestly believe and has been shown to you will work. That's why when we see people going, well, you know, if they go for this amazing piece of technology which we've got on paper or we've done one experiment with and it's theorized it's going to be amazing and we don't know why the armed forces aren't adopting it right now. Well, the reason is because the armed forces are looking at going, well, it could be great. It could be an absolute money sink which goes nowhere. But in the meantime, that offers us to do this, which we currently do with this, and this, which work. And we can order improved versions of that, while if that really shows promise, someone else will hopefully pay for the development of it. And then we'll get involved. Now, occasionally, you've got organizations like DARPA, for the United States. The entire mission is to invent tomorrow. Entire mission is to spend a lot of money and fail a lot of times. That's right. Okay? Organizations like that are going to fail because they are literally trying to invent tomorrow. They are trying to push the cutting edge. The vast majority of projects they're involved in will fail. But that's fine. That's especially set up and it's expected to fail. And anyone who demands that they succeed is cutting them and destroying their future. They will fail. Their failures will produce even other things which might well go on to great success. But also, their occasional successes will be astounding. Things like the internet, etc. That comes from British research, British programs, and American research by DARPA and various other organizations. Being fused together is what brought about the internet. And that's amazing. But trust me, there were a huge amount of failures en route to achieving that. If that had been a military development by the minister, let's say the pure British Ministry of Defence or the Pentagon, the failures would have sunk it. We like to joke about programs like the F-35, etc. No. Those programs, compared to the programs we're talking about that really do invent the future, they are stable. We might see hiccups, we might hear some problems, but those aren't complete and utter self-destructions. And that's the whole reason why the helicopter isn't available in World War II. It's because when you're looking at it, it changes everything. It has the potential to change everything. This is an amazing stepstone change in the way World War II would have been fought, in the way World War II was. But it's also a huge leap of faith. And there are very, very few officers, very, very few people who would take that leap. Which is why I was kind of lucky when asked about this, in that there is this officer. There is William Moffat. Moffat is one of the few officers who might well have taken that leap. Might well have taken that leap. But they didn't demonstrate it to him. And so he didn't have the chance to take that leap. They demonstrated to the US Army Air Service, and they weren't prepared to. Not as much. They did some little funding, but nothing like he would have arranged. And before anyone asks, yes, the Royal Navy had officers around who would have probably taken that leap as well. There is Blackhouse, there's Henderson, there's a couple of them. And there's a couple of others in the US Navy and a couple of others. But those officers are rare. Officers who are prepared to put it all on the line to develop the future. People think they're putting on the line their careers. They think that's the courageous thing. No, they're not. They're putting their souls on the line, for want of a better phrase. Because they are making a bet that what they're investing in is going to save and help lives. It's going to save their fellow servicemen. It's going to help them. And if it fails, if it doesn't live up to its promise, then they're going to have to live with the burden of all those lives which are going to be gone. That's going to be their fault. That's incredibly scary. It's one thing to risk your career. It's a completely other thing, another consequence, a whole nother bar to risk, well, for want of a better phraseology, to risk filling cemeteries. That's asking someone to do something else. And it's very few officers, very few people are going to be sure enough of themselves, are going to believe in themselves enough, and are going to be confident enough of something they see in front of them, or their perception of it, to do that. What have we got coming up? Next week, it's Conception, Operation, Conclusion of the Ark Royals. It's a fun one. It's going to be a fun video. I've rewritten it about 6 times. I've recorded about 4 different versions. Goodness knows when the final version will actually be recorded and done. It will be up 23rd, 24th, but it'll be up. Thank you very much for watching, and hope you enjoyed. And thank you everyone for your support. I don't say this often enough. I probably should say this more, or rather, I don't really know how to say this more or say this better. This channel will not be here without your support. Naval history and doing all this stuff, being able to do it as much as I do get to do it instead of doing other jobs, is entirely thanks to you. Thank you. And the sheer quantity of Iron Brew which keeps me going is thanks to you. So thank you very much to the people who... There are... I didn't realise until someone said, but there are some people who don't want to be a patron because they don't like Patreon. They don't want to be a YouTube subscriber, but they like to go elsewhere. And so we have Ko-fi, and this was the chat between Shipshape crew of setting this up. The messages I receive with the buying a bottle of Iron Brew and buying some Iron Brew, it's lovely. The personal messages I get from people. And yeah, some of them are patrons, some of them are members of the channel as well. And thank you to all those people who do both. But yeah, really the messages through Ko-fi, they bring a bit of a smile to me. Thank you. All of it brings so much support and so much kindness. But yeah, sorry, I received a couple of messages over the last couple of days which have made me giggle. And the money does go on Iron Brew. Because trust me, I get through a lot of the stuff. Probably shouldn't, but it's semi-medicinal. It stops other things going wrong at the moment. Thank you very much, and take care. Oh yeah, and YouTube keeps telling me off on others. If you like the video, please like the video. If you'd like to, please share the video, because if you share the video, more people might get a chance to like the video. And if you want to, please subscribe to the channel to see more videos, or there's membership and there's all sorts of other things down there. There's also Ko-fi up there, and that will hopefully make YouTube happy, because it keeps nagging me because I don't do this enough. Because apparently I'm bad at it. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. And I haven't added a question today because, frankly, I think I've talked enough about things that if you need a question to get you started on commenting, then I've really missed a plot in this video.